Hello, and welcome back to the show. I'm Emily Chen Newton, and you are listening to the Adaptive Climbing podcast series, Everybody Climbs. This is a collaborative series, which is why I'm here on your Sends and Suffers podcast. So a big thanks to Mario Stanley, the regular host here, for welcoming us to the platform. In this episode, I'll talk with Emeline Lakrout, a paraclimber and disability rights advocate. She's been blind since childhood and has competed on the U.S. national paraclimbing team since 2022 and currently lives in and loves the hustle and bustle of New York City, where she works as a marketer in the consumer products industry and uses that expertise to consult brands on disability inclusion on the side. Among other things, she guides brands on the language they use around disability. In our conversation, we get into some of the history of disability rights and the importance of language as it can shape the image or idea of a community, and how our language can impact how we see ourselves. I'll be honest, Emeline took me on a bit of a journey with my own language in this conversation, and she is the exact right person to do that. As someone who's worked on disability awareness campaigns, legislative lobbying, and good old community mentorship, she is a force to be reckoned with. She's an ambassador for the National Ability Center and a member of the ParaCliffhangers. In 2023, she won a paratriathlon championship in the adaptive division for blind women. And of course, with climbing being her true athletic love, in 2024, she walked away as the paraclimbing national champ for her category of B1. Now, let's get into the episode so we can talk about exactly what B1 means, as well as other terms in the adaptive sports world. Tell me how you got involved with climbing to begin with.
Yeah, so my sports background is fairly limited. I've been legally blind since I was a kid. When I was a kid, it wasn't enough that I was using a white cane full time, but it was definitely enough that I, needed quite a few accommodations, and I couldn't necessarily participate in sports the same way that everybody else did. But I was sort of asked to. So by that I mean I was 13 years old, I'm in 8th grade PE, and we would play soccer. And I ended up getting hit in the face twice, 2 days in a row, while we were playing soccer. And after the second time, my teacher warned me that if it happened again, that she was going to have me sit out the rest of the year. And that was really difficult, like 13-year-old girls are not exactly at their peak self-confidence. You add in a disability, and I was definitely not in a place with myself where I was like, okay, this is fine. I thought, dang, I'm blind and broken. I can't participate. I don't want to get kicked out of this class, and then I can't be with my friends, and it'll be all weird. And so that sort of informed the rest of at least the next 10, 15 years, where I was like, all right, blind people can't do sports. I guess I can't do sports. And that was wrapped up in lots of other internalized ableism as well, but that was very much me. I didn't do any physical activity. I moved to New York City in 2021, and at that point I had been to college. I had learned a thing or two about the disability community. I learned that there are sports for blind people, and I had done a little bit of beat baseball and that kind of thing. So I knew it existed, but I just kind of assumed it's okay, I'm not really a sports person anyway. But it turns out maybe that wasn't so true, because I moved to New York, and all of a sudden I don't have all that many friends. I'm looking to meet some people, and I especially wanted to meet other disabled people because I loved having a disabled community. And so I literally just went online and I started Googling New York City disability. And I fell on this awesome webpage by the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. But that page was all about different adaptive sports in the city. And one of them was rock climbing. And I thought that sounded cool. It sounded like a good way to leave my house, really more than anything. And so I started going, and I went every week. And it was my Thursday place. And then work got a little bit stressful at that point. So then I found out there was another climbing group. So then I was going twice a week. And it honestly just kind of snowballed from there.
And you mentioned something, beat ball?
Oh, yes. Beat baseball. Yes.
A P or with a T?
With a P at the end, yeah.
Oh, okay. Very different from beat baseball, which I was thinking.
I don't know that I know enough to really comprehensively describe it, but essentially the bases give like a constant buzz, and you have this big ball and it has a beeper in it, and there is running to the bases and then there's running to the ball. But essentially, yeah, it's baseball reimagined for if everybody is wearing a blindfold. So it's a fairly developed sport.
Well, because in the grander scheme of things, I don't just report on climbers with disabilities. I report on all athletes with disabilities. And right now I'm working with this crew of blind sailors. And
oh, cool.
So cool. I've been learning so much. And they've been telling me about, these, when they do the shorter races, they have these acoustic buoys that make noise. That is how you guide yourself throughout the course by listening to these buoys of different tones and like different pitches, so you know which way to move your boat.
Oh my gosh, I need to get myself some blind sailing experience. That sounds awesome.
I know. So anyway, I'm getting very off topic here, but all of that is to say there are so many different ways to be involved with sports, and like we don't often think about the ways that sound plays a big role or can play a big role if we allow it, if we're not so dependent on the visuals all the time.
Absolutely. I don't know how familiar you are with ocular centrism, but it's something that was introduced to me by a wonderful book by Dr. Leona Godin, who herself is blind. And essentially deconstructing this idea that our society is largely centered on vision. Vision is the most important sense, to the point that we don't even realize that our art, the way we understand the world, it's naturally shaped by what medium we experience it in, and that medium happens to be sight. And a lot of times when we start to try to adapt things, if we come at it from this ocular-centric perspective, we're kind of locked, right? We're trying to replicate the experience of what it is to navigate the world in a sighted way. But when you start to intentionally disconnect from that, like the doors open up so widely, and there's so much creativity that's possible in completely reimagining how we want to approach something, how you want to solve a problem if you don't use your sight. And obviously this plays into a much larger phenomena where we see all kinds of inventions made by disabled people for disabled people that are like totally revolutionary. But you can also even bring it down to just as simple as like, all right, maybe there is actually like a really brilliant way that you can sail that's easy, as long if you completely like disconnect from doing it by looking. The sports that I do, we tend to still be in that sort of ocular-centric framework, I think. I don't have a great example in my own athletics about it, but I do think it's always so important to realize, like, just because we understand, like, reality is what you see, right? Like, sight is just so ingrained. Like, imagine, and I think it's always just a really cool thought experiment, like, imagine if that's not the case. And I don't want to get, like, too philosophical, but, like, literally thinking about what that means was part of what helped spur on the Enlightenment. Diderot, a very famous French philosopher, like, he was obsessed with that, because up until then, they just assumed, in a lot of ways, like, right, like how medieval people thought, a little bit boxed in, but it was like, what you see is what is real. That is reality. People balked at the microscope because they're like, there's nothing there. If you can't see it with your own eyes, it doesn't exist. They thought it was just utter science fiction. And part of the Enlightenment was like, okay, look at blind people. They can't see, which means that they can't see reality, which means that not all of reality can only be experienced through sight. But anyway, it's a whole thing. I think it's really fascinating, but it plays to exactly with the beat baseball. They didn't think, oh, how is a blind person going to deal with like hitting a little ball with a bat? They just totally reimagined it because they gave themselves the flexibility to break out of that ocular-centric like framework.
It's like trying to get somebody the sighted experience instead of trying to get them whatever experience they can have.
Exactly that, yes.
Something that it brought to mind is something Justin Salas and I have talked about, and Justin is another blind climber, and he has worked with some gyms on designing to make them more accessible. And something that he has really tried to kind of spearhead in this idea that when you're setting routes, what if you set a route of the same texture and same shape? So you're not relying on the visuals at all.
Yeah, no, exactly. My home gym doesn't really do that, but I've climbed at another one that's not too far, and they tend to do that just, I think, for aesthetic reasons. But if you might be on a route that has every hold has ridges, and the one that's also on that same rope that's the other route might all just be smooth slopers, and that makes a huge difference. Honestly. So for me, with very low vision, to the point that I climb with my eyes closed all the time. I never use my sight because at this point, it doesn't help. That the tactile holds are so wonderful. And honestly, a big chunk of my climbing when I'm training is just trying to stay on my route. Climbing in competition in one way is so freeing and so much fun, and even honestly easier, because if I feel something, it's mine. It's so much like I can put my foot and move. At my home gym though, because I want to make sure I'm staying on route so I'm training properly, like I put my foot on something, I grab something, I have to wait. And blind climbing is already not super fast. And so unless I'm like really sure that I got the one that my caller said, like I have to wait a hot second, make sure that's the right one, and then push off. Trying to reposition a foot chip when you are on two very small crimps, because you want to climb that route correctly. That is exhausting. I you could give that a shot sometime. Maybe that should be a type of training, is like you go up, you grab a thing, and then you gotta move your foot 2 inches to the right to get it on. Yeah, when gyms can do tactile and fully non-visual options so that you can just climb and move, like it's a night and day climbing experience for me.
And then it also brings up the point, and this is also a term, I might get it wrong. I think it's called, is it universal design? Where like when you do something that you think will benefit a small group, but it actually ends up benefiting a much larger group?
So it is and it isn't. What you're talking about is something called the curb cut phenomenon. Maybe there's a kitschier term, but yeah, that's the phenomenon where you create something for disability, for accessibility, and it ends up being better for everybody. And the reason that works is I like to think that we're all sensitive to the things that disabled people are sensitive to. It's just that for some of us, that is a full stop barrier. And I think that even small improvements, we all feel it, even if it's not a night and day. But of course, we have those very black and white examples where a gym sets something for a specific disability, and everybody's like, this is so cool. It's a different flow, great for practicing campusing, all this stuff. Yeah, you have the subtle benefits and the very obvious benefits. It's very comprehensive.
Well, and like as you mentioned earlier, like, yes, the intention was to make it for people who don't have great visibility, great vision, but in the end, like, it also makes this really cool visual effect.
Yeah, it always will. That's if anything, that's what we've learned is you know, the electric toothbrush was invented for disabled people. The touchscreen invented by a guy with carpal tunnel. The vegetable peeler invented by a woman with arthritis. Like, that's how it is. And same at the gym. It's a really cool experience for everybody. Nobody loses when we look at accessibility.
Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned that, the style of climbing, you know, as in a competition, also what you've described is outdoor climbing.
Yeah.
Like anything is on.
I've done a little bit. I've done outdoor a few times. What I've heard, the conventional wisdom is that blind people really tend to enjoy outdoor climbing because, to your point, everything is on. I think the aspect of it that I loved was getting to interact with scenery in a way that I just don't get to anymore. You know, on the list of like, you know, everyone's like, oh, you lose that much sight, it must be terrible. It's fine. I'm quite happy. My life is pretty awesome. But the one thing that I haven't been able to just find a way around is like, I can't look at pretty pictures anymore, and pretty pictures are nice. But when you climb outdoors and you feel the rock, like I felt kind of like Indiana Jones out there, all the texture. I was looking for my own holds. That was cool. That said, the only con for me was just that there's dirt and bugs, and I am a little bit of a city girl. I think also something to keep in mind are the barriers to getting outdoors, and I think there's great initiatives from like ACF, and there's obviously just so many wonderful programs like ParaCliffhangers, and I know ACG does the same thing, helping to get adaptive climbers outside. But at the end of the day, to do it regularly, like to get to these areas, you need to drive. A lot of times you're working with lead climbing, which can be done by blind people, but very complicated, all of this stuff. And so in a lot of ways, being able to take the subway and pop out at my gym 3 times a week is much more doable than trying to get out of the city.
And just to pop in with a couple of those, so ACF, Adaptive Climbers Festival, and then the Adaptive Climbers Group, in case people are newer here and are unfamiliar with those groups. But they're definitely ones to look up if you want to get more involved. So yes, I was going to say the approach is definitely a thing, and understandable why just taking the subway to your gym is easier. Also makes me think of places other than the United States. You know, like if we were in France, you could take a train to Fontainebleau, you know, and get pretty much right off the train and walk a little ways with a crash pad. But in America, we are very car dependent, which doesn't seem very friendly for visual impairments.
No. And, you know, you don't want to get me started. The term that I often like to use is car infested. But yeah, it's one of the reasons I wanted to move to New York City was because of the transit access. And I always like to tell my blind friends, like, the blind scene in the city is off the hook. And I think part of it is just that when you're blind and you live in a place where you can finally get around without a car, it's just so freeing. So yes, transit access, super important. One of the key ways to get blind people really integrated into the world and be able to live full lives. And I am just constantly so grateful that I live in a place where I can live without a car and I can actually get around. And maybe it's a little slower for me. Maybe I get a little bit lost, but at least I can do it. And I mean, there's no replacement for that feeling of like, oh, you want me to go to a happy hour tonight? Sure. Yeah, that's not complicated. Yeah.
Like little things like that, if we all just spend a little bit more effort thinking of how can we make our existing structures more accessible? Because we can't always start from scratch. You know, like that would be ideal, but we can't. So like, how do we make our existing gyms, our existing social structures more accessible?
So there's something around accessibility that, you know, if you want a space to be really inclusive, the people themselves need to be as well. And so by that, what I mean is when I walk into my regular gym here in the city, there are 2 adaptive groups that climb there. So I know they know I'm coming. When they see me go up to the counter, they help me scan in my little badge because it always takes me like 5 tries to figure out where the little scanner is. When I walk around the gym, you know, people might move a sandbag out of my way just to make my life a little bit easier, and that kind of thing. And I think in contrast to that, I think of a blind friend of mine who lives near a bouldering gym. He had moved, and because he knew me, he was like, I really want to try climbing. This would really work out. It's really close. Like I could walk there. And I said, yeah, you totally should. Maybe shoot them a note and just explain, hey, I'm blind. My friend does climbing, and you know, here's how she does it. So I know it's kind of an established thing. We don't have to be reinventing the wheel. Would just love to maybe come check out the facility and you know, meet anybody. And the gym's response was essentially that they didn't feel that they could help him, which was very sad because I know that it's not complicated, and he had explained exactly what he would need, which is essentially somebody maybe able to go around with him or to call. And if the gym didn't feel comfortable having a staff member do it, I don't see why they couldn't have connected him with maybe members of the gym or said, come out, let's talk, let's figure it out, let's experiment, or we have a class, you could come. The answer was really just no. And that was very sad to me. And so that's what I mean by the socially inclusive part, is that for climbing to work, it might be physically accessible to someone, but if the staff and the management aren't also open to that and open to trying something a little bit new and being inclusive, it'll just kill all of the momentum right there.
In this world of social media that so much, I mean, at least maybe it's my personal algorithm, but I see a lot of really positive interactions, and it's like a harsh reminder of reality to hear that like that's not always the case. Like, my Instagram feed is a lot of like really inclusive rock climbing groups and all this really cool stuff, and we're taking people outside, and like that's not always the case. That's really unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think climbing is one of the most inclusive athletic communities out there. It's phenomenal. But I'm over here. I am now a competitive rock climber. I've climbed internationally in competitions. I do triathlon too now. Like I'm, working out 5 times a week, and I never ever would have started any of it if there wasn't an adaptive specific program, because of my childhood experience and all of the fear wrapped up. Oftentimes as a disabled person, we are walking into spaces that were not made for us. We were a complete afterthought. It can be made even worse if the people around us are almost surprised that we're there in a space. And a lot of times there's a lot of baggage wrapped up in that. It's not like somebody's walking in and for the first time they're like, dang it, like I can't, be part of this class, or dang it, they asked me to come back another day. That's not the emotional experience of something like that. The emotional experience is, oh my God, very, very, I almost want to use the word traumatizing. I want to be sensitive to that word, but it's very jarring. It's a very extreme experience to be denied access to something because of your disability. And so, yeah, I only started climbing because I knew for a fact that when I showed up to this program that I would be treated with respect and compassion, and I knew that the conversation would be how to get me up the wall, not if. And that is the only reason I went there in the first place. And so that matters very, very much, that people know it's going to be a safe experience for them.
Yeah, and I think that's really important that you point out, when these experiences happen, more than likely, it is not the first time, which is why it hurts so much. It's why it stings so much.
Yeah.
It's like, fuck, again.
Exactly. Exactly. It's really, I'm like now flashing to certain experiences I've had. It just, wow, it really shakes you. So, yeah, and again, some people might feel it more than others. I think a lot of times when we are a child with a disability, we get that internalized even all the more, because as kids, we don't always know how to deal with that. But yeah, so anyway, yeah, the emotional inclusion is so important.
And I don't know if you've ever found yourself in the situation where it's almost like then you end up having to do some self-regulating, because like that other people don't know that this has happened to you 100 times. Like, and then I've had this experience in medical settings where like a little thing will happen. Somebody says something or does something, and I have this like gut reaction because I spent 6+ years in and out of medical offices not being believed for the symptoms that were happening. And then I'll run into somebody and they say something like offhand, and I'm like, oh my God, stabbing my heart, but they didn't mean to stab my heart. Like they didn't know, but then I'm like trying to regulate myself. And then I'm like very distracted by my own self in this setting. And it's like this very complicated internal monologue that ends up happening, and then it's like hard to focus on what's going on around you. And you kind of just have to like reel it back in and then appear like everything's okay.
Yeah. There's a big debate, at least among the blindness community, about our responsibility to educate. And specifically, I think of being on the street, and I walk with a white cane, so I'm very visibly blind. And so I get all kinds of interactions on the street. Sometimes people will just grab me. Maybe I'm headed for a trash can and they just felt the need to move me instead of just letting me deal with it. Or when I'm going to cross the street, and people will, sometimes they'll be maybe more conscious than others. Sometimes they'll say, no, don't go. Or they'll say, it's red, right? Like those are different ways to communicate that information. And so, there's been days where like you are the fourth person to grab my arm without asking me, which throws me off balance and is honestly scary. What is my responsibility to respond? Is my responsibility to take a minute to explain, hey, I have the cane. And like, I know maybe you thought it looked like I was going to run into that, but my cane was going to pick it up and I would have sidestepped it. Like I walked like miles every day by myself, like this would have been okay. Or is my responsibility to at least just be very, kind and polite so I don't give a bad, image to the blind? Or do I not have that responsibility? And is it not my problem that these people are touching me in ways that I don't find comfortable, and I deserve to just react the way that I want to? No, I think it's an ongoing conversation because you can see the merits to each of those, right? But also the important piece is that we're just human, and that we do our best. And so I think what it comes down to is when you're in the climbing gym, a space that I know so many people find so much relief from mental illness and depression and anxiety, any little way that we can give that same experience to any disabled person, I think is really wonderful. And also just coming at it with patience, also being kind to ourselves. If we don't know how to interact with somebody, like, it's okay, somebody probably did something worse that day. And so also not being afraid. I don't want this to turn into a fear of doing something wrong. Frankly, if you approach it with respect for that human being that you're speaking to or trying to work with, it's very difficult to go wrong. I'm speaking more to when we're not willing to engage. That's really the painful, when the painful experiences start.
Let's talk a little bit about language, because I think that oftentimes that is something that stops people from interacting at all. That they're like, I don't know what words I should use to talk to you. So
Yeah.
when we talk about disability in sports, you and I have spoken some about like person first language or excuse me, but just like all those different types of terms and ways to think about the terms. Let's just talk about that a little bit. Let's get into that a bit.
Oh, opening the floodgates, Emily. There is nothing I love more than disability language, and I want to start with, again, if this is your first time interacting with disabled people, it's okay. Take a breath. Nobody will bite your head off about this. Just if somebody says, actually, I prefer this, that's totally okay, because I think this topic easily gets scary. But that said, let's get into the interesting history of it. So originally, the term used to refer to disability was handicap. Handicap is a term from English horse racing, and it would be a disadvantage that you give to a horse racer, and it would literally be pulled out of a cap. So that's why I call it handicap, right? Hand and cap. So it's part of this whole like horse racing thing, and then it eventually got applied to impairment. And so when you start to scooch into the disability rights movement, the 60s, the 70s, and this is not actually the first time, but basically one of the first times into the modern era where we see disability rights activism. And so you had a bunch of these activists come together, and they wanted to come up with a term for themselves. They wanted something that they decided that they wanted, and they looked around, and they saw this word disability. And a couple of the reasons they chose it was, one, they saw that in Scandinavia, this was a word that was used, and so they thought, well, that's progressive, right? That's a good thing. And their other thought was that the term disability is not euphemistic. And also, I'm pulling this from Judy Heumann, who's kind of the mother of disability rights in a lot of ways. She talked a lot about this. The term disability is not euphemistic. It doesn't allow you to shy away from the fact that there is an impairment of some kind. And that was a big thing for them, was like, we may, and I want to be, again, cautious how I phrase this, but I'll frame it in the way that I authentically would. We may be broken, but so what, right? Like, yeah, my eyes don't work. That's a fact. I'm not like shying away from that, but also kind of, so what? What does that matter about my value as a human, or my ability to do certain things? Or like, if I want to do something and I think I can do it, like, why would that matter? And so it's really staring in the face that there is something that's not working like other people, for them it does. So that's why they chose the word disability. And if you look at the time, there was a lot of identity first language, which is saying disabled person. You put the word disability before the word person. So you'd say, I'm a disabled woman, or I'm a blind woman. That's all identity first. Now, as time starts to go on, there begins to be a push for something called person first language. And so it's saying, that phrasing would say, you are a person with a disability. You are a person who is blind. And the push for that, largely from what I can tell, came from scholars who did not themselves have disabilities and parents of children with disabilities who themselves did not have disabilities. The idea behind person first language is that it's dignifying. You're putting the person is not defined by their disability. They are more than their disability. And this was popularized a lot through later in the 90s and the early 2000s. Now, at the same time, you had a schism, right? You had this huge movement of people saying person first is more important. But if you look at what disabled people themselves were saying, there was always more of a leaning towards identity first. It's not universal. Not everybody prefers identity first language. But who does prefer identity first language? Well, some big organizations that are actually made up of and led and represent these communities. So for example, the National Federation of the Blind, they published an official statement in one of their official conventions of a strong preference for identity first language. And their big reason for that is it's always blind is not a bad word. We can't see. We navigate the world. We are blind. We can't see. And we celebrate that. And we are prideful at that. And we do not adhere to person first language because we feel that that infers that blindness is something to be ashamed about. A lot of other communities, National Association of the Deaf, same thing. Autism Self-Advocacy Network, Little People of America, same thing. And so, and again, if you look at individual activists who are active in the space, they tend to prefer identity first language. And again, the reason is that as we move into what we call the ADA generation, so the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's passed in 1990. It is the most sweeping piece of disability legislation at the time. And it changes. People born before the ADA and people born after the ADA have very different conceptualizations of disability, because for those of us born after 1990, we have a lot of rights. We know that we have the right to an education, we have the right to employment, we have all these rights. And so that was able to usher in this era of disability pride. And so it's gone even further now in the last 10, 20 years, where people, we see the emergence of the word crip as a word that people reclaim. Like I love to call myself crip, and I have a t-shirt that says criptastic. Again, not everybody loves that language, but it's in general, because people are really owning the fact of disability and saying, yeah, I'm disabled, and that's not a shameful thing, and it's not something that I feel needs to be behind the word person to shield us from it. So yeah, that's the whole background. Now, specifically in athletics, there's been this really interesting language shift that I've observed. In a lot of sports, triathlon and climbing are the same. We have categorizations, for example, for blind people. We have B1, B2, and B3. And we're separated like that because maybe in triathlon, you get a little bit of a head start if you're a B1, which means you have very low to no vision, over a B3 who is maybe legally blind, but maybe they're the kind of person who doesn't even need a white cane. Like they have quite a bit more vision, and B2's in the middle. And so I've seen in the athletic community, we'll say I'm a B1 or I'm a B2 to describe our vision to each other, whereas outside of athletics, we might say I'm a high partial, I'm a low partial, or I'm a total to describe the same things. So I just think it's really funny how sports have begun to kind of interplay and give us a new language to be able to talk amongst ourselves about it. But yeah, this language is relevant in sports. I think probably not everybody is as nerdy into the history of it as I am. But, everybody in adaptive sports has a disability and certainly will experience this language and likely have their own perspective on it.
Something that you said about, if you were born after or, lived most of your life after 1990, do you think that made way for more disability pride and almost like developing this like pride in the culture as opposed to just like being preoccupied by fighting for basic rights? I think it really did enable the culture. I think, some people say that because the ADA gave us so many rights that there hasn't been as much protest and fighting as there was. I mean, to get to the passage of the ADA, we had, that journey included the longest sit-in of a federal building in history.
We had the Capitol crawl, where people got out of their chairs and just started crawling up the steps of the Capitol. We had people chaining themselves to the outside of McDonald's to get McDonald's to be accessible. That was ADAPT back in the day. So there's this long history of stringent protest by the accessibility community. And I think maybe there wasn't even all that much room for just thinking about identity and it's a luxury that we have today, even though in some ways, like, we still need to be pushing and moving forward. But yeah, I think there's been such a shift in even the last 5 to 10 years. I think of this great memoir I read by a Paralympic equestrian rider, and she's blind. Her name is Laetitia Bernard. She's French. And she was talking about how many gyms that she would go to try to work out and train. 'Cause when you're horse riding, like, you really got to do off the horse work. And just how frequently they would say no. They didn't want to work with her. They didn't want to, they worried about liability. They worried about all this stuff. And she describes how in just the last few years, it's gotten so much better. And I think part of it has been a larger movement in diversity to move towards that. We had like Black Lives Matter, and we have all this LGBTQ plus activism. And if we look at history, like, it tends to be in that order. Like, first, the Black movement moves forward, and then LGBTQ plus, and then disability behind. And I think, like, we've benefited from just a general cultural movement as well. But yeah, no, the ADA generation is absolutely the thing that has propelled disability into a culture like it is today.
Well, and you mentioned the LGBTQ plus community, and I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of not necessarily direct correlations of language, but similarities in how we think about language and how we approach language, mainly that if you don't know what to call someone, you should just ask.
Yes. I didn't even mention that piece. I got wrapped up in the history and the philosophy. But yeah, at the end of the day, if you don't know, ask that person, do you have a preference? I think sometimes, we can feel awkward because we also don't want, what if that person is really sensitive about their disability? So it's always helpful, like, do a quick Google, right? Like, 10 minutes on Reddit. All right, this is what these people tend to prefer, so that maybe you can feel a little more equipped. But I even now I can kind of run down, for the blind, it's usually visually impaired, low vision, or blind. For the deaf, it's hard of hearing or deaf. For people in wheelchairs, right? Wheelchair user. A lot of these things, like, that's where you start. And I think that offers a baseline. And I think at the end of the day, we as individuals, we have the power to do that research, to ask the question in a really respectful way, but also be nice to yourself, because ideally, if we had better media representation, these are things that would just be normal to know and to feel more comfortable with. So I think, like, we all deserve a kind of a collective sigh of, like, okay, it's okay that I don't know this. Like, this is a structural societal reason that I don't know it, and that's okay. And I'm gonna learn. And as long as you're always approaching with just respect, and that's just another person that I want to interact with, you can't really ever go wrong.
You've got me thinking about so many things now. Like, I'm asking myself, like, how do I talk about myself? What do I want to be called? And I think would I call myself a disabled climber? I think I would, because I feel part of the disabled climbing community. Would I call myself a disabled person? I wouldn't. And isn't that funny? Isn't that weird? Because, like, I don't actually feel part of a larger disability community, but I do. I feel part of the adaptive climbing community. I don't know. I'm just, like, processing out loud. Yeah, isn't that funny?
That is fascinating. And I think you also speak to some people, like myself. I'm blind. It's a very easy thing to say. People understand what it means when I say I'm blind. And if I say I'm disabled, like, nobody bats an eye. I don't want to say it's an easy identity, but it's fairly clear, right? There's a clear roadmap. A lot of disabled people, right, there's this spectrum. It's an identity. It's, it might have taken a long time to either say, actually, this is how I feel, right? Like, disability isn't a diagnosis. In some ways it is. You can look at like the 80s legal definition, but in a lot more important ways, disability is an identity, and that sometimes gets lost in it, but that's what it is. It is an identity, and it's something that people need to decide for themselves, but it's also fluid. Like, if you feel like when I climb, I'm disabled, like this impacts me in these ways, and I identify as a disabled climber, but you don't want to identify as disabled in your everyday life, whether that's like maybe one day you will, or maybe you just generally don't feel like that makes sense for you, that's totally okay. Because I think, as you mentioned, we can learn so many lessons from the queer community in identity can change, and we can use it as a tool to understand ourselves. And disability is exactly the same way, that we can use those terms to help us, talk about ourselves, understand ourselves, and it's okay if it moves around, if it changes.
And like even the subtle shift of which word comes first, because like I very much would say I am a person with a disability, 100%, 24 hours a day. But I wouldn't say I'm a disabled person. But I would say I'm a disabled climber. I mean, I think there's something about, just because, like you said, it's an identity, and I have an identity and experience in that community that feels like something, well, it feels like something that I want, and it is a community that I am in. So I would put that word first within the context of climbing, but not within the context of the rest of the world. And also maybe that has something to do with the way that people would see me. Because I mean, I think I'm very much like, I don't know if I should put this in air quotes or not, but like very much able-bodied passing, like most people would meet me in the airport and not think there was anything wrong. And so, I wonder, like, it's making me think about the way that I am aware that I come off to people, if that changes the language that I then feed back to myself about myself. You know what I mean?
It does. The experience of having an invisible disability, it could really, how I like to describe it is, because as a kid, I was in quite a similar boat. Like, I was very sighted passing. I like to say it kind of wreaked havoc on my self-identity, because it's very, very challenging. I think there is more dialogue now, but it's just starting, about the reality of, a lot of people are living with various disabilities, and you can't see it. And there's sort of this expectation, right? And something I always try to deconstruct is like, we move around the world assuming that unless proven otherwise, everybody is completely able, able-bodied, neurotypical, everything. And I think that's an incorrect assumption. And that's what tends to be really difficult for people then with invisible disabilities, is there is this unspoken pressure to come off as not. Like, there's no in between. Either you are very obviously disabled, or you need to be passing, or you're like, there's kind of this taboo against being in that in between, about communicating these needs. And especially when you start to talk about less well understood disabilities like chronic illness, just so afraid of the taboo, and like, how can I claim I'm disabled? And what will people think? And I'm sure, like, you probably have that experience, because it sounds like you're dealing with chronic pain and chronic illness, something that's just so little understood. So yeah, it's a difficult experience, absolutely. And also then it creates like, and I know I always am really intentional. How do I make sure that when I'm creating a space for every person with a disability, I want to create a space that people with invisible disabilities feel really validated? Because in my experience, those are the people who often like need it from me the most, if that makes sense. Like, when I had my disability club back in college, or now I'm sort of doing the same thing with, I guess, my air quotes, disability club at work, is, anybody can come here. And to have a person with a white cane be like, hey, like, you and your disabled experience matters a lot to me, and I see it. I found that really helps people. So anyway, it just comes back to really validating, empathizing, and if somebody tells you this is what they feel, just believe them, and don't assume everybody's going around the world with a disability, because statistically, like 1 in 5 people has a disability. It's very, very common.
Yeah, just believe them. I mean, again, going back to the similarities with the LGBTQ plus community as well.
Exactly, yeah.
You said something earlier about that when you started working or going to an adaptive climbing group, you were comfortable going there because you knew it was a question of how they would help you get up the wall, not if you could get up the wall.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and like the things that have made a difference for you when you started climbing and the things that like really made a difference for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think already like having a safe space was so important. I think my terror at least is always like, what if I can't do something I really want to do? And I have found in my life, like, the list of those things is like almost non-existent. But you're just so ingrained. I've encountered people who sometimes almost take pleasure in being like, well, you're blind, right? So like, you might not be able to do everything. And I always kind of am like, why do you, I know that. I don't know why there has to be this question of like, but you realize, right? Like, it might be something you can't do. Like, okay, but let's like back up from that tone. Because frankly, like I've been able to do just about everything. Like I went to Switzerland, for my competition last year. I got there a day early. I took the train by myself. I wandered around the city a little bit by myself. I took the tram to my hotel by myself. Like, and again, and I give those examples, like, a lot of times there's just an assumption of like incompetence. But it might be my internalized like experience speaking. But anyway, to your point, what did the adaptive session do that was great? One thing was that I knew that they would know what to do. So by that I mean, even if I go somewhere and they're willing to work with me, a lot of times what I'll be told is, well, you're the expert, so you tell me. But if I'm showing up to a new thing, I'm not really the expert. Like, if I showed up rock climbing, I wouldn't really know what to do, what's the technique, like what's the thing. And so, the fact that I show up here and they're like, no, we know, we're the experts, like, that's just great. For once, I don't have to be the one like with the sole responsibility of troubleshooting this. So the way that we climb as blind people is we have a person on the ground. We call them a caller. Some people, the Japanese team is famous for this. They'll roll up a magazine and they shout at their climber. Other folks, we just do like a Bluetooth headset phone call situation. Usually do that when you're just starting out. And then kind of the higher tech solution is to have a dedicated sports headset so you can listen to your caller. And as you climb, the caller will talk to you. People have all kinds of different styles. Some blind people, they don't want to hear anything from their caller unless they actually need help. They just want to reach up. Whatever they touch, they go up. Some people, they just want to be told if they're off, right? So you'll hear my caller doing this all the time, just shouting at me, off, right foot off. And so as they climb, maybe the caller is just telling them off. I like a little bit more micromanagement. We have a system with my caller now that we've developed where it's an Emeline inches coordinates situation. And so by that I mean we would say right hand, right 2 up 4. So that would mean right hand, move it right 2 inches, up 4 inches. That's your next hold. The Emeline inches piece of it is just, I think an Emeline inch is like 1 1/4 regular inches is we did the math on it. But yeah, so that's how I get my directions. And I personally prefer to have quite a bit of direction. Like, I want them to kind of tell me every hold. One thing that I'm working on is actually being able to memorize climbs a little bit better. So when we're on the ground and the caller is working through the beta, I do my best to memorize maybe sections of 3 to 4 at a time. The cruxes especially, I'll really try to like visualize it. But that's all part of blind climbing, right? Like, this is such a new sport, such a new discipline that we're still learning, like, what are the things that I need to work on specifically for me? So yeah, that is physically actually how I climb, is I have a caller, gives me directions, and then, as you start to climb more and more difficult stuff, like it can get really intense. And it's really fun to just observe. People at the gym always love to watch her too and like just listen in because it's so impressive.
As a blind climber, do you actually train lock-off strength more, or does it just kind of naturally build within you because that's how you're climbing?
It builds naturally to a very great extent. If you see a casual blind climber, they're going to have the massive lock-off strength compared to a casual sighted climber. Now, me specifically, I actually just started my strength training regimen with Power Company Climbing now, and so that's something that we're kind of working out is like what makes the most sense. But I think in a lot of ways, like we benefit just like anybody else. Now, one distinction I can speak to is I really didn't want to climb dynamically at all, ever. I'm not even talking about a dyno. I'm just talking about kicking hard, swinging up. It was, for a while, I just thought, maybe that's just not a move for blind people because it's very difficult to recover from that if you miss the hold. And also just like we have this whole system, but at the end of the day, my collar says like right 24, up 16. I'm like, oh gosh, that's far. So that was something we drilled really intentionally was, all right, I got on a wall and there was like a big move where I was going to have to do that. And we just did it over and over and over again until I started to get the hang of it. And I started to trust that I could do that kind of movement. Fortunately, because of blind climbing and the static climbing, like I have so much raw power built up because, you'll hold on to something for your life. That's rarely been the issue. The issue has usually been I either don't have the confidence to go for something or I don't know what it's supposed to feel like. I don't know what it looks like. We have to kind of start from scratch. Another fun thing my collar does is like, how do we describe holds? Especially in competition, you get one shot. So I'd better have like a decent idea of what I'm grabbing and how to grab it. And so we like to do food. A lot of people I've heard like to do food. So there's like bread loaf holds, there's banana holds. But she'll get sophisticated. Like she might be like, okay, imagine like a baseball, but then you cut it in half and then you smushed the middle in, right? Like she'll be very descriptive. But yeah, there's an entire art to calling and describing.
You mentioned some of the strength aspects. Lock-off strength is huge. Are there any other things about having a visual impairment that benefit you as a climber?
That's an interesting question. I think my endurance is pretty solid. I can spend a long time just on the wall fighting. Blind climbing is just inherently slower when you're waiting for somebody to give you every single direction. And then maybe you forgot where they said to put your right hand and they got to circle back. Or you start to move your foot, but then they're like, more right, you didn't quite do it. Just all of it. Like you learn to be so much more sturdy and be able to sit there for so much longer. I'm trying to think. Advantages.
I mean, the mental aspect of trying to clip a bolt, and you're having to wait and readjust and go out and you try to clip the rope through the carabiner and you can't quite make it, and then you have to put your arm down and kind of shake out and try to, like, that mental aspect of being okay with being in one place for a while.
Yeah. That might be more relevant if I wasn't too scared to try lead climbing. I did start to learn how leading works and the theory of it. And I'm sure I'm gonna get there at some point. But yeah, no, the mental fortitude. Yeah, part of being blind is like a lot of things are harder than they are for other people, and so you just kind of get used to doing hard things a lot of the time. I will say though, as somebody who never had the benefit of working out, when I started climbing, like it completely changed how I saw myself. It built up so much self-confidence, so much just knowing I'm physically strong. Like I was such a little noodle before I started climbing. And I started climbing, and all of a sudden I had some muscle, and I like physically felt great. And I also knew I could do hard things, and it's completely life-changing. And I'm so grateful that I got to do it. And my big thing now is I just want to make it possible for other blind kids, because I know exactly what it feels like to think, oh, I guess I can't do sports because of who and how I interact with the world. And now that I've discovered that I can do the climbing, which has been a gateway into the triathlon, I'm like, wait, blind people can do so much of this stuff, and it's so beneficial. And, disabled kids of anybody could really use the confidence boost. I just want to, I want to take every kid and put them on a climbing wall, especially every disabled kid, because I think that would just make so much of a difference in so many people's lives.
Well, and that's exactly where I wanted to end things, because I know that you're involved with a bunch of groups, and you also do a lot of advocacy that you mentioned earlier. And so this might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but just like name drop some places and organizations that folks could Google later. We'll put some stuff in the show notes.
Oh yeah. Oh boy, here we go. Okay, resources. Yeah, climbing specific ones. You have two national organizations off the top of my head. We have ParaCliffhangers and Adaptive Climbing Group, who you referenced. I climb with both of them. They're both great organizations and have chapters all over the place. You also have the National Ability Center. They have a great campus based in Utah. They have rock climbing, but they also have like whitewater rafting and horse riding, and they offer all kinds of programming and scholarships for disabled people to just have a blast with outdoor recreation. They're really cool. The triathlon, I do it with an organization called Achilles International, which, spoiler alert, is an international organization. They have chapters all over the place if you want to run, cycle, swim. And then, some of the work down in Texas, we now have an adaptive sports league. So basically in Texas, you have this interscholastic league of, they have sports, but like it's kind of everything. And it's all overseen by this body called the University Interscholastic League. It's for K-12 students. And so UIL a couple of years ago, they passed a bill to integrate an adaptive sports program into it, which didn't exist previously. And so that's sort of my claim to fame, is I was a real thorn in the side on that bill, just off to the side, getting people to email their reps and getting some endorsements from some community leaders to help get that bill over the finish line. There's also, if you are part of a gym and you're looking for resources, Degree, which is a deodorant brand here in the US, I helped them create this adaptive toolkit. And basically it's just like a PDF, when we have a list of, all right, in your space, like you need to have this much clearance between equipment, and you need to train your staff on like this list of things. And to just get like some of the basics down, that's a great resource as well. There's more. There's more. If you start to Google adaptive sports, adaptive climbing, like you can start there. And the big thing is like, it starts with an attitude, and it starts with like a good idea. All of these things started with somebody saying to somebody else, like, what if we just did this, like on a small scale? What if we started it? Like, so if these things don't exist in your community, have a talk with your gym staff or start a Facebook group. You can start anywhere and do some really amazing things.
Hell yeah, Emeline. Well, that's a good place to end.
Whew. Oh my gosh.
This was a great conversation. I mean, we got into some stuff that I knew we would get into because I had told you beforehand, but we went to a lot of places together. So.
Yeah, we did. And thank you for the opportunity. Like, you're such a fun interviewer too. You kind of just like let your subject roll. And you told me talk about disability language. Go. I mean, come on. Start with English horse racing.
Yes, you did start with English horse racing. I thank you so much for your time today. You've been listening to Everybody Climbs. I'm your host and an adaptive sports journalist, Emeline Lakrout. To reach out to me about the show, use the Instagram handle EveryBD Climbs. That's every, then the letter B, the letter D, climbs on Instagram. This is a collaborative podcast presented across Plugtone audio platforms. Big thanks to Mario Stanley, the regular host of Sends and Suffers, for letting us land here. And thanks to Chris Hampton for organizing the whole thing. And of course, thank you to Emeline for coming on the show today to give an important history and linguistics lesson to us. If you're interested in some of the resources that she has to share, check out the show notes for this episode. That's all for now. Climb on, climb strong, and remember, every body climbs.